Good evening and welcome to Monobiology. And in this lesson we're going to learn about incomplete dominance. And this involves a little bit of a stepping away from what we've learned about Mendel so far. Because in this situation there are no dominant alleles. In fact, you'll have in an incomplete dominant situation you'll have two alleles that are not dominant to each other. And therefore, we're stepping a little bit away from Mendelian genetics in the sense that there are no dominant and recessive alleles. So the first thing you need to know about this is when there are two alleles that are not dominant to each other, you're dealing with incomplete dominance. Now, the effect of having two alleles that are not dominant to each other is that you always end up with a third phenotype. Right? So think about Mendelian genetics. You have your dominant allele and your recessive allele. There are two possible phenotypes. You can either have the dominant phenotype or you can have the recessive phenotype. With this situation, you still only have two alleles. However, you're going to end up with three possible phenotypes. The phenotype for the homozygous situations and the phenotype for the mixture of the two alleles, which would be the third possible. And we can't call it recessive, we can't call it anything other than the third phenotype because there is no dominant and there is no recessive in this. So because of this, problems involving incomplete dominance will involve a third phenotype, one that wouldn't be present in Mendelian genetics. This third phenotype is going to be a mixture of the two alleles, or if you prefer, it will involve the heterozygous condition. So how do you solve a problem involving these, and what's an example of one? Well, an example of one involves snapdragons, which are flowers. And when you cross a red snapdragon flower with a white snapdragon flower, instead of getting a Mendelian kind of ratio, which if one was dominant to the other, let's say red, would be all red offspring, you actually get all pink offspring. So there's your third phenotype. Let's have a look at how to solve these problems. Okay, so let's for these questions, you pick a letter for the trait. So in this case, it's flower color, so we use C. And then the allele itself is either going to be red or white. So there's two alleles, just like there was in Mendelian. So CR equals red, and CW equals white. But again, remember, these are not dominant to each other, so therefore they are both written as capital letters, not dominant to each other. Okay, so a red parent is crossed, a red flower plant is crossed with a white flowered plant. And again, these are not dominant and recessive, so I should be capitalizing everything just to keep it consistent. So the genotype, if the CR individual is red, and remember this is incomplete dominance, then we assume that the phenotype, red, is represented by CR, CR. And that's going to be crossed with CW, CW. Okay, now the gametes that this individual is going to produce are simply the CR. It's only one. They can produce lots, but they're only ever going to be CR. And CW for this parent. Now, if you cross a CR with a CW, sorry, do that part. Should just be an R like that with a CW. You're only ever going to get CR, CW. Now, because this is the heterozygous condition, and neither the red nor the white is dominant, what we're going to end up with is something kind of cool in this case, which is pink. Okay, so the F1 generation is going to equal 100% pink in this case. Okay, and you can do a Punnett square to show that. I essentially did, but I didn't draw out the Punnett square itself. Okay, so in this particular situation, notice we started with two phenotypes and we ended up with a third phenotype. Okay, and unless it says in the question that it's a multiple allele situation, which this one wasn't, then you have to assume if you end up with, or if there are 3 different phenotypes, remember the key word there is phenotypes. You can have lots of different genotypes, but in this case, there are 3 different phenotypes, then it has to be incomplete dominance. Okay, so if you're reading a question that you know there are 3 different phenotypes, and it's not multiple alleles, and it's not Mendelian, then you're going to assume that it's incomplete dominance. And the best way to solve an incomplete dominant question like this one is to use a letter like we did here for the trait, in this case flower color, and then superscripts that represent the various alleles for it. In this case there's only 2, so CR would mean red colored flower and CW would mean white colored flower. Okay, so let's try one more cross on this just to show you how this would work. Let's try a cross between a pink flower and a white flower and see what we'd get. If we crossed a pink flower, which is CRCW, with a white plant, which is CWCW, what would be the expected phenotypic and genotypic offsprings? Okay, so this parent, the pink parent, can produce 2 gametes, which would be CR and CW, because remember, those are going to separate during meiosis. This one, on the other hand, can only produce CW, because that's all it had to begin with. So our Punnett square, in this case, would be a 2x1. And here would go the CW, and here would go the CR and CW. Okay, so if I cross these 2 individuals, here's what I'm going to end up with. CR, CW, and CW, CW. What does that show? That shows 50% of the generation would be pink flowers, and 50% would be white. Notice the red didn't come back. That's because in order to get red, I need a CR combined with another CR. And if I have a white parent like this to begin with, there is no CR to give, so I'm not going to get any red flowers out of that. And that, in a nutshell, is how you first identify and then solve questions involving incomplete dominance. And remember, it is important that you can identify. We've talked now about monohybrid crosses, dihybrid crosses, multiple alleles, and this is a 4th type of question that you could get. So keep that in mind. If you're not sure how to identify these things, or if you're having trouble with any of them, make sure you ask questions in class, and I'll certainly be willing to help you with that.